treason, sedition, rebellion. This is the heritage of the American patriot. Those revolutionaries who stood on principle to fight against tyranny no matter the cost. And that spirit lives strong today in the activists and freedom fighters who fight against the authoritarian state. Each in their own way, each with their own mission, united for the cause.
I had the idea to run on a platform of fuck the police prior to actually winning the primary.
I mean, AOC is a drama queen and she's full of shit.
They said, you don't get to tell us no, we're the state health department, and I said, hell no.
You brought a freaking guillotine.
People already pushing back in ways that didn't even need any votes to be cast.
I'm not ratting on anybody, and I did what I did, so you're going to have to give me what the law says you have to give me.
You want to make the world a better place? Have some babies and raise them to not be stupid.
Hope I don't get canceled talking to you.
These are the people whose stories I'm here to share. I'm Justin O'Donnell, and this is Subversive.
Man, governments are not going to like this shit.
Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, activists, anarchists, and people of the internet, thank you for tuning in to Subversive 75. As always, I'm your host, Justin O'Donnell, and before we get started, just remember whatever platform you listen on, whether YouTube Live, Odyssey, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or on Anchor or on LRN.FM, you can help grow the show by liking, commenting, subscribing, and most of all, sharing with your friends. And if you enjoy the content, you can join our awesome team of insurgents over on Patreon, visiting patreon.com/O'Donnell. Again, that's patreon.com/O'Donnell. And make sure to check out our sponsor, snackswag.com, where you can get all your favorite Liberty merch, including some official Subversive podcast merch. We got great designs for t-shirts, hoodies, mugs, patches, dresses, and skirts. I've designed about half of it. The other half is just pretty cool. So you should head over and check it out. It's the only place where you can get your merch that you can literally your messaging on your sleeve with your favorite brand today. And if you want to keep in touch between shows, make sure to follow me on social media, join our community Discord channel, where you can chat with other fans about the show at any time. All of these links are available in the description of the video or podcast you're listening to. So make sure to give them a visit today. Now, the trending political drama this week that we're talking about, embroiling the country, once again centering around a controversial decision by the Supreme Court. The political divide on the issue of abortion has been building for years and decades, but everyone's always assumed that Roe v. Wade was settled law. Heck, even half the Supreme Court justices on the current bench, when they were nominated, said they believed the Supreme Court was Roe v. Wade was settled law and didn't need to be revisited. But yet again, they did so. They overturned Roe v. Wade. They found that the previous decision was egregious in its understanding of the 14th Amendment and the Constitution in general, and created rights that weren't implicit in the Constitution. Now, me personally, I think people should be more upset about the Supreme Court basically removing protections against double jeopardy last week as a much more egregious offense. But nevertheless, it's the social issues that are going to divide this country and put people against their friends and their family and members of their community when they don't need to be. But regardless, for the first time in a long time, this country is having a conversation about the 14th Amendment, which makes the timing of this really auspicious, because joining me for the show tonight to talk all about the 14th Amendment and his new book, 14, How the 14th Amendment Ate the First 10, author and Libertarian and Free State Project luminary, Ian Underwood. Ian, thanks for joining the show tonight. How are you?
I'm good. Thanks for having me. Luminary. That's quite the word.
Well, I've said it before. I do largely consider you probably one of the smartest people I've ever met. You're one of the few people who every single time I've gotten the chance to talk to you, I've come away learning something. And I expect to learn something new tonight as well. And it's, I know before the show we were talking, and Jody was chastising me for missing your talk at PorkFest. I am upset I had to miss your talk at PorkFest, but I will be going through all the video before it gets uploaded, so I will get the chance to see it at some point at least. So, yeah. Now, so the biggest, I think the biggest surprise for those of us who know you and have gotten to know you over the years here in New Hampshire about your book is that it's your first book.
Yeah, it is. We've done a lot of writing. This is the first time it's ever been available in book form. I mean, I spent years and years writing about math for a site, Ask Dr. Math, thousands of pages. I've written a bunch of stuff now for Granite Grok. Writing is actually probably my preferred method of communication. But yeah, this is the first time. And so, right, what's happening is I've given a bunch of talks. and they're just the right size for books. So I'm into books, you know.
Yeah, it's funny when I talked to Jody a couple weeks ago about having you on to talk about the book. We joked because of the timing of Porkfest coming up and my schedule and vacation happening. By the time I got you on, you might have published your second book, just because you had everything
It's
ready
coming
to
out
go.
soon, yeah. It's actually, I think it's just, we got to review it and get a cover and get some technical stuff done, and it'll be out. So
Awesome. Well, I look forward to it. I look forward to actually getting the chance to pick up this book. But the 14th Amendment is a really controversial subject, not even just amongst constitutional scholars, but now because of the actions of the Supreme Court and politicians kind of hyping up the issue as a social issue, it seems like all of a sudden everyone in the country has an opinion on the Supreme Court, and most of them are really ill-informed. Like what was the background like that pushed you to start looking into and decide you were gonna like really take this deep dive into how bad this particular amendment was?
well, so it really always comes down to, and this is in the book, it's you're surrounded by situations where people pick up the Constitution and say, you can't restrict my freedom of speech except during elections and during advertisements and, in 1,000 other ways. And, you can't search me without a warrant unless I'm in a car or in an airport or, any number of exceptions. And so, after you see this for a while, you start wondering, how is this even possible? Is it really that these guys can't read? Is it really, because it starts to feel like that, and so I started looking into it, and I came across a great book called A New Birth of Freedom by, I think his name's Charles Black. He's a law professor at Yale or Columbia. And for the first time, I saw this, I got exposed to this whole idea of the 14th Amendment and incorporation, and started thinking about that and how that really, was, on the one hand, one of the most remarkable things ever, where a government actually intended to give away power, which never happens. But they went through all the steps. They went through Congress. They went through the state legislatures. And the intent was to say, you know what, we are going to bind ourselves further. It's not just the federal government that has to obey the Bill of Rights. It's all the states too, which is amazing. And, so then you look at it and you go, well, why didn't that work? And the reason, you have to go back, right? The reason it didn't work is because we had a coup in 1803 that most people aren't aware of, which is a case called Marbury versus Madison, in which
I think we've had a number of coups that people aren't aware of.
Yeah, but this was just a really amazing situation where the Chief Justice said, we have been called a nation of laws, but from now on, we're a nation of judges. In that it's like, from now on, it's the job of the judiciary to say what the law is. Not to say when a law conflicts with the Constitution, not to say whether somebody is inside or outside of the law, but what the law is, which is an incredible thing to say, and an even more incredible thing to get away with.
It's fascinating because I was just earlier this week doing some research and some reading for an article I was writing about the January 6th committee and the meaning of insurrection and the history of insurrection and rebellion in the country. And I was leaning a lot on Thomas Jefferson's letter to William Smith, often quoted. Libertarians, conservatives, patriots, people in the 3%er crowd and military fans often quote the quotes of the Tree of Liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of pirates, tyrants, and patriots. They missed the whole first half of that letter, though. And the whole first half of that letter is Thomas Jefferson proclaiming to William Smith his issues that he has with the Constitution as drafted. And one of the subjects he gets into is about how his experiences in Europe and in Denmark in particular, he doesn't believe a supreme judiciary with that much power would be safe for the health of the republic.
Right. And it wasn't supposed, there's supposed to be co-equal branches. And as of 1803, it's really the Supreme Court's up here and everybody else works for them. The legislature's there to send suggestions to the court and say, well, we think we should have a tax to do this. And say, no, what you really have is a fee. or or in the case of the 14th Amendment, where it's like, okay, that moment in The Princess Bride when the one guy turns to the other guy and he's like, you keep using this word and I don't think it means what you think it means. And that was exactly the first chance that the Supreme Court got to look at the 14th Amendment. And they said, oh, that phrase, privileges and immunities in the United States, it means something completely different, which apparently you weren't aware of what you meant. So we're going to tell you what you meant.
To me, I mean, I've never gone beyond the surface of the 14th Amendment in my dislike of it. And when I write about it, and because I usually always just cursorily refer to it as a problem when I write a lot about slavery and the history of slavery. And I'll point to the fact that when everyone says we abolished slavery with the 13th Amendment, I'm like, yeah, and then the 14th Amendment legalized it and regulated it. With the clauses.
Okay. Tell me more about that. In which way did it legalize and regulate slavery? Citizenship?
Well, just Section 1, the citizenship clause, naturalization clause, at the end of it says that no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of the law, basically arguing that the state could decide at its whim to deprive someone of their life, liberty, and property, and that it was no longer, you weren't be held a slave by another man or business or for profit, but now the state held the monopoly not just on violence but on slavery and servitude.
Interesting. Okay. I mean, because certainly you could be deprived of liberty and property. I mean, the Fifth Amendment talks about that. So there was no surprise that if you commit a crime, you can be deprived of your liberty. And as punishment for a crime, you can be deprived of your property. I mean, it's an interesting thing that you would look at it that way, because I would look at it as essentially them saying, however we're going to go about it, we have to do it the same for everybody, which of course is also not true, but it's a nice aspiration to say everybody's going to be treated equally.
Well, as you say, if the courts are interpreting their own rules and the courts are left to interpret the Constitution at their own discretion, the court gets to decide what due process is and how it's applied to each individual and what can be taken from them.
Yeah, sure. Which is, I mean, if you're going to have courts and you're going to have punishment, you're going to define crimes, at some point you have to operationalize that. You have to say, here's what we mean by a trial. Here's what we mean by a conviction. Here are the rules for those trials. And you have to do that at some point. And, again, as long as the same stuff applies to everybody, it could be bad, but it's not nearly as bad as not having equal protection, right? So,
sure.
The alternative is so much worse.
Now, but the coup with Maybury, and what were the immediate ramifications versus the long-term ramifications, and were maybe some of the ramifications that lead you to consider it a coup against the Constitution unintended or unforeseen?
I think they were unforeseen. I mean, I also quote a letter from Jefferson. I forget who he wrote it to, but he basically says this idea that it's up to the judiciary to say what the law is, turns the Constitution into a thing of wax, which they can mold into any shape they want. And that was like 15 years later. So he may not have it may have taken even Jefferson, time to figure that out.
To me, that's very reminiscent of the Spooner quote, the Constitution be one thing or another, this much is true. It's either allowed for the tyranny we experience now to exist, or it's been powerless to prevent it.
Yes. So again, there's aspirations and there's what you actually are able to accomplish, which is why, personally, I don't put a lot of stock in the Constitution. I would prefer to just go back to that one sentence from the Declaration of Independence and start over from there and say, let's take that seriously.
Or we could start with Article 10 of the New Hampshire Constitution. I am partial to that one myself, personally. The right to revolution.
But it doesn't. Right. It's what I like about the Declaration is it answers the two fundamental questions. Why do you have a government at all? And from where does it get its power? And if you actually say the purpose of government is to protect rights, not to protect people, not to protect property, to protect rights, a person with intact rights can protect himself. If that's the purpose, and it has to get its power from consent as opposed to majority rule, that wipes out almost 95% of all the bullshit that you don't like. All that stuff goes away.
Well, that's an interesting way to phrase it when you say a person with intact rights can protect themselves. And it's an interesting assumption that everyone with intact rights can and is in fact capable of protecting themselves. I mean, doesn't that almost lend to an argument of might makes right? And if you can't defend it, you can't keep it.
Well, you can't, but one of the things that you're allowed to do if you have a right to free speech and a right to property and a right to travel is you can set up mutual defense societies, which in fact, under this theory, that is what a government is, right?
Right.
We'll all agree to defend each other's rights. Somebody comes on my property, I can call you for help. Happens to you, you can call me for help.
That's one of my most fundamentally pressing questions in anarchist philosophies. At what point does your organizing with your neighbors become a government?
I mean, it almost, and to me, if you look at consent, it almost doesn't matter, right? And so this is something I've talked with some people about, like, well, what does a government by consent look like? And the first thing you have to realize is consent is not majority rule. And you also have to realize the people who wrote those documents know that it's not majority rule. So I don't know how many people realize this, but if you look at the Constitution, Article 5, and it says, here are the rules for amending the Constitution. And then it says, there's one thing you can't change, right? You can change anything you want, but you can't change this. No state shall be deprived of equal suffrage in the Senate without its consent. Consent. If 49 states want to change that, one of them can say no. That's consent. That's not majority rule. So what would government by consent look like? And the way I think of it is just this, and this is a fun exercise to do with a group of people. You can do it at a party next time you're drinking. Sit down and start making a list of sentences of this form. I don't want anyone else to do X to me, right? I don't want them to, assault me. I don't want them to take my property. I don't want them to hurt this that way, where somebody's doing something to you. And you make that list. And what I've found when I've tried this is it's a surprisingly short list. It's hard to get over a dozen things because you pretty much cover everything, in the first 4 or 5. Don't hurt me. Don't take my shit. Right.
Yeah. Don't hurt people and don't take their stuff. The fundamental way to teach libertarianism to children.
Yeah. And so you end up with a list that's a little more specific than that. But here's the thing. So then now you've said this, and now you basically apply the golden rule and you say, okay, I agree that if I do any of these things to somebody else, I can be punished. Right? Now that's a huge difference between I say, I don't want anybody to take my stuff and I don't want anybody to pay somebody else for sex, right? Which has nothing to do with me. There's no consent. So that's when you step outside consent and you start using government to control other people rather than to protect your rights. But a government by consent would be terrifically small. And I don't care at that point whether it's anarchist or there's a government. It doesn't matter who you elect because they're basically bookkeepers. So, it's when you go beyond that you have a problem. And that's why I would, if you went back to that one sentence in the Declaration, what's the purpose of the government and where does it get its power? And start from there and throw everything else out and say, we're not going to have any structures that aren't consistent with this. You would end up with nothing like you have now. So,
all right. So, what have been like Mayberry being the first example you're giving of a coup using the 14th Amendment? I mean, your average American, when you ask them about the 14th Amendment, the only real case using the 14th Amendment as precedent that they can cite off the top of their head is Roe v. Wade. And even most of them don't know that Roe v. Wade cited the 14th Amendment as its precedent. But
Roe v. Wade didn't, and it was the second one, Casey, I think, where it got
Planned Parenthood v. Casey.
But they were saying, look, there's this implied right, and it's just the 14th Amendment. Then they would say they'd have to incorporate it.
So what have been some of the most egregious rulings or interpretations of the 14th Amendment that you get into? Because the title of your book is How the 14th Amendment Ate the First 10. There's a
Right.
lot there because there's a lot in the first 10. You have speech, you have privacy, and you have cruel and unusual punishment. You
Mhm.
have the right to keep and bear arms, the
Right.
right
So-
to property in the third.
Right. So, I mean, one of the things this is bare minimum books, and so it is not a legal treatise. I am not going to go through zillions of cases. What I'm trying to do is elucidate a structure of what happened, and for that, you can take any case where, say, you know, somebody challenges AR-15 ban, and the Supreme Court says, "Oh, that's fine," or you take the things that you see are coming, where they'll say. You know, you have Kavanaugh saying, well, we can't have machine guns because they can't be constitutionally protected because we have laws against them. Where, first of all, I mean, they're not banned. You can't get one as long as it's old enough, or you have a class 3 license. But just so these are people, you know, they totally become untethered from the text of the document. They don't need to look, they don't need to consult the document. And so what I'm talking about is the mechanism by which that happens, which you can sort of illustrate, you know, so that the history part that you need to know is really briefly this, that, so they threw out that first privileges and immunities clause. They just killed it and said it doesn't mean anything, really. You know, what it means is you have the right to travel between states without paying a tax or travel on an interstate waterway. And that's it. So at a certain point, then you have a couple of Supreme Court justices who are like, well, maybe we're a little hasty, and maybe some states ought to have to respect some rights, like freedom of speech. So they've already said, well, we can't just say that's a right that has to be respected because we killed that. However, what we didn't kill was this idea of due process. Everybody's entitled to due process, right? Well, what's due process? It's process. So they invented something which is substantive due process, which is the part of process that's substance, which of course there's none of it. So like an empty cup, the value of that phrase is it means nothing, and it can't even mean anything. But once you have substantive due process, then you can say, oh, well, something like the right to say a certain thing in a certain context is part of substantive due process. And so therefore it's protected by the 14th Amendment. So for instance, to, you know, say a certain kind of thing during an election might actually be part of, it's not a right to free speech, but it's part of substantive due process, right? So we don't have to respect your right to free speech, but we do have to give you substantive due process, which actually includes this part of free speech that we like and not the parts we don't like. So it's a little like one of those things, I don't know if you've ever done this, where you're making like tomato sauce and you put tomatoes in and you turn this crank and the seeds and the skin go in one direction and the pulp and the flesh and the sauce goes in another direction. That's the 14th Amendment. That's substantive due process. Oh, well, having a gun in your house, that's substantive due process, but taking it outside your house might or might not be. Or it might be if it holds 10 rounds, but it might not be if it holds 15 rounds. Or if you can pull the trigger this many times or bump it against you, right? So here's this framework. It's not a right anymore. It's due process. And so now you have to, at some point, you know, push comes to shove and they're like, okay, what the hell do you mean by substantive due process? How do we know if something's substantive due process or not? So now we go to step 2, which is we say, oh, well, something is covered by due process if it's implicit in the concept of ordered liberty. And so if you read like this Dobbs decision, you see concept of ordered liberty all over the place. So what does that mean? Again, empty concept. It can mean anything they want. But what they chose to make it mean is this. In your mind, imagine someplace, Fredonia, a place you'd call a free country.
Maybe
in that
New Hampshire.
Okay. No, like in your imagination.
Yeah.
Free.
Someday.
Imaginary country, which you would call a free country. Can people there own a gun? And or can people be restricted from owning a gun? Can you say in that country they can't own a gun? And you would say, well, no, it's not a free country if they can't own a gun. Therefore, it's implicit in the concept of ordered liberty. But then you might say, well, can they own an AR-15? And you might say, no, that's okay. You can imagine a free country in which nobody can have an AR-15. So owning an AR-15 is not implicit in the concept of ordered liberty. So now you have this nice filter where you can say, well, I like this. I don't like that. I like
it
this.
almost comes down to subjective interpretation on every issue across the board. And
it couldn't even be more subjective than this.
If the reality is that it all comes down to subjective interpretation by a lifelong appointed supreme judiciary, in which there is no recourse to remove them or replace them or to even counsel them and ensure that they follow the will of the people or the will of the document, maybe the issue isn't the 14th Amendment necessarily, but Article 3 of the Constitution as a whole.
Well, yeah. So the thing about that they've used though is you build this idea of legitimacy, and that's what they're doing. So you can say, oh, well, they've decided this is incorporated under the 14th Amendment, so I guess that it's okay. And if it's not, then I guess it's not okay. And the thing is, there's this sort of bending over backwards quality to it, where you could ask a question and say, well, maybe there's a right to privacy. Is the right to privacy protected by the 14th Amendment? Well, is it part of substantive due process? Well, is it implicit in the concept of ordered liberty? And then there's a final part, which is, so suppose you're a justice and you say, well, yeah, they should respect this right. Like you should have a right to discuss things with counsel, out of the hearing of law enforcement. And then you decide, wait, unless there's drugs involved. and so suddenly you go, well, here's the final part. And you end up saying there are balancing tests, right? So we have to balance your activity, which is implicit in the concept of ordered liberty, but its exercise is outweighed by a compelling government interest in, public health or protecting
the compelling government interest is always a phrase that I've despised at every level, because the reality, if
it's good,
it's supposed to be a government of the people, for the people, by the people. I mean, you can go on and say the people are stupid, but how can the government's compelling interest be at odds with the interest of the individual or the people if the government is the people?
Oh, I mean, people as mass. No, I actually see how that could happen. My only problem with it is that if you have something you're calling a right and it can be outweighed by compelling government interest, it's not a right.
Right.
It's something else. Because a right is always the right to say no. It's the right to be left alone in some way. And if the government says, well, yeah, you do have the right to be left alone in this way, unless we need to, make people feel like elections are safe or whatever excuse you come up with. And so it's completely subjective. And so the court can sit there and go, well, and so I use an example in the book, which is, so imagine you're at a baseball game and it's some perennial power and they're playing some, perennial crappy team. And so the guy from the perennial power comes up to bat and he hits the ball and he steps on first base and then the ball arrives. And you're thinking, okay, he's safe, right? But now suppose the first base umpire says, well, okay, you have an expectation of being safe if you arrive before the ball. However, society has a compelling interest in competitiveness. And since your team is usually doing pretty well, we're going to call you out, right? Can you even imagine this? I mean, the country would blow up even more so than Roe v. Wade. People would go crazy. What do you mean he was out? He got there before the ball. What is going on here?
So oddly enough, though, I think we actually do see that in sports. And I think that's what makes this kind of a really good comparison.
Where have you seen this in sports?
it was actually controversial and people got really upset about it in hockey and football recently in the past few years on different occasions, where there was a really bad call by the referees. They made the call, enforced it, and then kind of realized and got the vibe from the crowd that it was a bad call, and would make a phantom call on the other team to make up for it that ended up costing them the game.
Okay. And people went crazy.
I forget which teams it was, but it was a playoff game in football. And it ended up determining the outcome of the game. It ended up determining who went to the Super Bowl. And in hockey, it ended up happening to the Las Vegas Kings with an incredibly egregious, major penalty that took a player off the ice for the last 4 minutes of the game after they were up and winning the game in a playoff game 7.
Right. Now, those are simple mistakes. The guy just blew the call. I'm saying, I'm talking about a situation where
they
it's
make
clear.
phantom calls. Like the referees in those sports, they'll make phantom calls to make up for a bad call.
Right. Okay. But still, I'm talking about something where they're just saying, you know what, it's clear what happened here, and I know what's going on, and I'm changing the rules on the fly, because courts do this every day. They just, oh, you know what, yeah, you thought this meant something. It actually means this other thing entirely.
Yeah, and in baseball, especially in baseball, when a pitcher is pitching and gets caught with a foreign substance on their hands and cheating pitching, the umpire has discretion. They're not required to kick them, but they get discretion during the game on whether or not to punish them or allow them to finish pitching.
Right, but the umpire doesn't get to make up new rules. That's the fundamental thing I'm getting at. He doesn't get to just make up new rules and have every other umpire forever bound by that, right?
Sure.
So, I mean, and it's really instructive to think about this. Suppose something happens that's never happened in a game before. Like, I don't know, maybe this has never happened. The guy hits the ball and it just explodes into powder. Can he go to first base? Can he not go to first base? At that moment, the referees have to make a call because the game has to continue, right? Is he out? Is he safe? Does he just keep batting? What happens? So they make one call in that one game, and then you know what? Nobody else has to abide by that call. In another game, somebody else could do something different. And then at the end of the year, the rules committee sits down and goes, we need to make a rule for this.
Sure.
Right? And so the way all this stuff should be working is, let's say Congress passes a law, and it turns out it was really badly written, and all the judges look at it and say, well, this is what it actually says, and if you wanted to say something else, you'd better fix it. Oh, that's what's supposed to happen.
That's what happened in California with that
rape case. What actually, just mentioned something. What actually happens in practice is they just say, well, we're going to redefine some words, or we're going to, just say what this usually means is this, but it really means this over here. So now we get the result. And the
Justice Roberts will change the definition of a tax on a fly.
Yeah. So, and what the problem is then, every other judge forever until they, grow a pair and overturn something, which hardly ever happens. Every other judge is bound by this. This is stare decisis, right? That judges essentially make up the laws.
So do you think judges shouldn't be bound by precedent or the rulings of higher courts when they do make these decisions? Do you think maybe a lower court judge should have the power to say, maybe revisit this, it wasn't a good idea, and create a cascade to revisit a precedent?
I think that judges should actually say whether this person is inside or outside the law, or whether this law is inside or outside the Constitution. They should say that.
Yep.
And then if that's the case, it's not binding on, I don't think it should be binding on anybody else. This is his opinion, but it sends a signal to the legislature that they ought to clean that up. And so Jody had mentioned this, and it's a great case because it just shows how everything's on its head. I think it was actually in Oklahoma. So a guy got accused of rape, and what he had done was clearly, I don't remember the details, but what he had done was clearly out of bounds. But it turns out the way that the rape statute was written, it didn't qualify. It didn't cover this case. And so the judge basically said, I have to let this guy, if you're charging him with rape, I have to let him go. If you're charging him with something else, we can talk. But if you charge him with rape, what he did is not rape. And everybody went nuts. And they're like, well, you know what they meant. You know what the law was supposed to say. And the judge remarkably said, no, it is not my job to say what the law should say. It is my job to tell you whether this guy was inside or outside the law as written. And it is the legislature's job to fix it. And it's like, it was, I almost fell off my chair when I heard this, because it's like, this never happens, but it's exactly what should happen, right? The legislature makes the laws. The legislature presumably knows what they mean for those things to say. And if it turns out that they've said it badly, they've said it unclearly, they have nailed things down too tight or left things too loose, it is not for judges to, what was the phrase Scalia used, to correct some supposed flaw in the statutory mechanism. That's not their job. Well, it is their job since Marshall in 1803,
Well, so AJ asked a question in chat. He says, "Do you think that the American legislatures will do anything with these signals?" I want to rephrase that and say, "Do you think they can do anything with these signals and these responses?" Because I know there is a lot of data and research and polling data that's been done that shows, at least in the last 50 years, there's been a significant trend in diversion between the actions of Congress and the campaign promises of Congress and the polled desires of the American people. And we're showing that Congress, like, it does not matter how much of the American people, when polled, want something to happen. It doesn't influence Congress's actions or direction whatsoever. But if they do just poll those in the top 1% of income earners, there's a direct correlation between their desires and the actions of Congress. So do you think, I mean, I think judges should be at least in the top 2%. But
they should. I mean, but this is another conversation that you and I could have, and I'm sure it will be the subject of a future book, which is that I think elections are the problem. I don't think elections are actually a useful solution for anything. They solve one problem, which people, I think, don't understand. Everybody thinks elections are to get the right people into office, but there are no right people. What elections let you do is remove the wrong people from office without shooting them, right? That's the point.
It doesn't mean that that's not an option. It just means there's a better option on the table.
It just gives you a peaceful alternative to get that guy out of office. Now, it creates all kinds of problems if the guy's in office for 6 years, right? So I always imagine, like, some cops burst into a room and there's a guy, somebody raping somebody else. And he's like, turns to them and goes, no, I get 30 more minutes. Come back in 30 minutes, right? Because that's elections. It's like, Sununu gets into office and says, yeah, you know what? I made this.
So there's not a lot California does right. And, like, very, very rarely do I come across something that the California government or California law has set up that I think is like, wow, that's a good idea. But their recall system, where every elected official in California can be recalled by a petition of their constituents at any time.
I think that is a good idea, except you have elections, and having been through that kind of thing in Croydon recently, you see how little what happens in one of those recall elections or special meetings or whatever, how little it has to do with the actual facts, how little it has to do with the actual issues, how much it has to do with fear and marketing.
Okay? And emotion, like fear, marketing, emotion.
Right. And so I think there are so many problems with the fundamental idea of elections, right? Just going all the way back to if people are being elected, it means the people who are in office now have a huge amount of control over, even if they get thrown out of office, who they hand that power off to. So they're to their friends, to their party, to the people, the other people in the 1% who will all look out for each other. And so that creates an incentive to accumulate power. Even if I don't have power, my friends will have it. Contrast that with, say, sortition, which is how you select juries. We just take people who meet some really basic minimum qualifications and we say, you're in office now for 2 years, and then not after 2 years, which means you have no idea who's following you, so you don't want to accumulate power at all, right?
Absolutely.
So I think just the very fact that you have elections, you're already screwed. It's just... it's sort of like, I know you wanted to. Oh, one of the books coming out soon is called Barefoot Learning, and you said you missed.
Absolutely.
Right. And so the idea there, about just a spoiler alert, is all the technology that you develop for shoes, to stabilize this and keep this from twisting and doing that. It's all compensating for this one mistake you made, which is that you think you design shoes as if your big toe is in the middle of your foot. Right. and once you do that, you're done. You can't fix it. It doesn't matter what you do. So this is with elections. Once you actually commit to elections, you're screwed. And there's nothing you can do about it. You can try to make the elections better. You can try to make them more fair. You can try to make them, more secure. It doesn't matter because the fundamental idea is wrong. So...
No. On the notion of barefoot, I have been largely barefoot for the past 4 years at this point, haven't worn shoes unless in the office or forced to by circumstance. I've joked that they put all this effort into designing shoes to compensate for the fact that you're wearing shoes. If you were barefoot, your feet are formed naturally to do the thing.
Right. Well, that is it, right? But as soon as you put on that shoe, and now
Right.
you're jamming, you're shoving your big toe over here, and now you can't release the energy that builds up, and so now you've got pain. So now we have padding, and it changes your gait, and then so now we stabilize everything. So you basically have your foot cemented in place. So now your ankle gets all the force, and so you get ankle wraps, and now your knee gets all the force, and you got knee. Eventually, somebody will come out with hip bands, I guess, hip braces. But right, it's that kind of thing that you've made that one initial mistake, and you can never recover from it. And
so how do we recover for it? So it's like, what was the initial mistake? Was the initial mistake the 14th Amendment? Was the initial mistake Article 3 of the Constitution? Was the initial mistake the Constitution? Was the Articles of Confederation a better answer? Like,
yes, I think all of those were mistakes. I think the Articles of Confederation were a good idea. I think going to a constitution was the wrong idea. I mean, fundamentally, I think the whole Marbury versus Madison thing really was a tectonic. It's a huge shift in how the government works,
right.
and nobody really. It's sort of a snowball thing, A snowball starts out as it's this big, and it starts rolling downhill,
bigger and bigger and bigger.
And eventually, after a couple hundred years, the thing is large enough to roll over anything, and that's where we are now.
And you get Lochner v. New York, then you get Brown v. Board of Education, then you get
right. And so that's actually a thing I've written about somewhere else. I call it core cruxes after. So Voldemort in Harry Potter, spoiler alert, hides pieces of his soul in a bunch of different places. And so to kill him, you have to go get all those, right? So here's what the Supreme Court does. They say, well, there's a bunch of people who really want this kind of decision on abortion, or this kind of decision on education, or this kind of decision on guns, or whatever. And so we will give them those decisions, whether they're warranted or not, because now we have suddenly created all these constituencies of people who have a vested interest in saying we are legitimate, and we had the power to give them what they wanted, right? So what you really need, and this is, I mean, regardless of the issue, the thing I'm happiest about right now, I mean, there's two things I'm really happy about. One is that Clarence Thomas said for at least the second time, we totally screwed the pooch on the 14th Amendment. We should just go back and treat it like it means what it says. And that would be awesome. I don't expect to see that in my lifetime, but just for him to be saying that, I just want to send him a box of candy, and say, thank you, Justice Thomas.
Well, you're right, though. Him saying that has created panic, because now it's not Roe v. Wade. Now it's Roe v. Wade. Now it's Loving. Now it's every other decision that people care about that had some reference to the 14th Amendment in the decision.
Some of which might be decided in the way that they like, using some other rationale besides incorporation, which is just a horrible, horrible way to do anything. So that's what he's objecting to. He's not saying that the outcomes are wrong. He's not saying we got the wrong answer. He's just saying the way that we went about this, the mechanism that we use for making these decisions is just fundamentally wrong, wrong-headed, impossible, and not sustainable. That's awesome. That's a great thing to say. I'm so happy that I'm not the only person saying that. The second thing I'm happy about is you now have a lot of people who are actually in positions of power and influence running around saying, fuck the Supreme Court. Right?
Yes, yes, that's great.
Which is a thing that people have needed to say since 1803.
I love saying "fuck the Supreme Court." It's incredible to see people on the complete other political side of the aisle from me saying "fuck the Supreme Court," but those same people don't have the same reason and rationale, which is unfortunate. And whenever I try and explain to somebody, I'm like, I think the two best judges on the Supreme Court came from opposite political parties and were appointed by opposing presidents, and it's wild. Some of the best writing that I've read on any decisions has been dissents in cases where it was 7-2 or 7-3, and both Sonia Sotomayor and Neil Gorsuch are in the opposition.
Okay.
where Neil Gorsuch, who's a Trump appointee, and Sonia Sotomayor, an Obama appointee, agree on civil rights and the rest of the court disagrees, they're right.
Well,
almost universally.
but here's the thing. Again, the what makes all this really tricky is that people focus on the ends and they forget the means.
Right.
And so this is what exactly I'm talking about with core cruxes. If we give you, if we say something about civil rights and you're like, yeah, I like that guy, and I want that guy, and I like this court, right? Even if the reasoning that they use to get there either completely ignores the written constitution or more likely ends up giving the court even more power. Because that is a way, if I'm the court and I give you something that you want, the deal is, it's basically a deal with the devil. Well, yes, Brown versus Board of Education, it's like, they could have just said, well, we really feel sorry for these students and we really think this is a problem, but it's really not a federal issue. There's nothing in Article 1, Section 8 that says we can do anything about this. So we're just going to say, we're sorry, right? They could have said that, but they didn't. They said, oh, we are going to step in and give people the result they want. But now the cost, what is the cost of that? The cost of that is from now on, forever, we control education.
Right, but I also feel like Brown v. Board of Education didn't need. I feel like there are so many ways within the Constitution and within the rights of equality, and even within Section 1 of the 14th Amendment, where you could argue that separate but equal wasn't equal without having to create or decide it the way it was decided to create that precedent.
Well, where does separate but equal come from?
Right?
Is this something that a federal court should be deciding?
No,
but right, that's what Thomas is saying, by the way. And Dobbs, he's saying this is just without even saying whether you think abortion is right or wrong, without even saying anything about that. You can say it's not. This is not a federal issue. Our job, right? If abortion is in fact, a crime, it's murder, and murder is a state issue.
Well, I think with the abortion issue, it fundamentally comes down. I think the politics of the issue fundamentally come down to whether or not somebody believes it's a murder or not, which means it's a philosophical debate about whether or not you think a fetus is a life and has rights or not. So.
It is a philosophical debate, but it is also a really think about a legal debate, right? So the state.
Well, to me, the legal debate, the hang up I have with the legal debate is if you're going to acknowledge that there's these two sides of it, there can't be a compromise. It's a yes or a no, because murder or not, there's no in between on murder. And so when you do abortion with restrictions or banning abortion with exemptions, you're creating an exemption that allows for murder.
Here's the thing, Dustin. Okay, there is an in between. So when you kill somebody, it could be manslaughter, it could be involuntary manslaughter, it could be first degree murder, second degree murder, third degree murder. If you kill certain people, the jury might let you walk. You might say, well, this person will euthanize this person, whatever. Okay, this is basically there is a set of people who are in a certain club. And once you're in that club, people can't kill you without some compelling government interest. And the question then is who's in that club, right? And we can define it. That's a political thing to define who's in that club. Because there are people like, if you are brain dead, are you still in the club? Not necessarily, right? You're still a person, technically. Are you? Are you a person if you're totally brain dead and you're just on machines? Okay, and your children have the right to say, yeah, pull the plug, he'll die. Okay, did we just murder you? No, we didn't, because you were outside of the club at that point. This is a membership issue. And so that is, the people are voting who is a member. I'm not saying one way or the other who I think should be a member, but I'm saying it's a membership issue. And when you're a member, there are suddenly certain protections that apply to you. And you could actually say, you know what, you could do what's the thing that just cracks me up that you have, what's it called? Decriminalization. The pot is wrong, but if we catch you with it, we're only going to fine you. And it's are you kidding me? If it's not wrong, why are you fining me, right?
Right.
What's going on there? is it right or is it wrong, or should you just leave me the hell alone? And so you could imagine a thing where they say, yeah, abortion's wrong, but we're just going to decriminalize it. If you get caught doing an abortion, it's a $200 fine.
There is another specific question in the chat here from Jonathan Howe in New York. And this is a really interesting question. And I understand where Jonathan's coming from with it. So you say you're not a lawyer, you're not a legal scholar, you're just laying out things that lay out to you. Jonathan is a lawyer. Jonathan is a public defender in New York City. So he's asking, like, what's the connection between Gideon and the 14th Amendment? Gideon's the right to free counsel, because we know the Constitution guarantees you a right to counsel, but how did the 14th Amendment with Gideon make them decide that was free of charge?
Well, I mean, that's basically the court going, we like this and we don't like that, right? You have a right to keep and bear arms. It doesn't mean anybody has to provide you arms for free.
Right. Yeah, so, Bernie Sanders.
Right. So, you know, that is for somebody to, this is the court actually not being consistent and just saying, you know, we like this and we think you ought to have this. And there are other things you'd say it's a right, and say, well, if you can come up with it, then you can have it, right? This is, I wouldn't even say whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. I think for most of, you know, you're so far downstream already with so many things that people can be arrested for that they shouldn't be arrested for, things that are illegal that shouldn't be illegal, that it's so easy to ruin your life. If the government's going to make it that easy to ruin your life, then, you know, maybe they have some responsibility to give you.
I almost feel like I could make an argument that it's in a compelling government interest to provide you a free attorney, because if they're actually trying to prosecute you and you are forced to defend yourself because you can't afford one, even though you have a right to one, appeal on ineffective counsel.
Well, but that assumes that, you know, due process includes that kind of appeal. They might just say tough shit. Okay. But again, so what was the question? What's the connection? I mean,
so I'm not terribly familiar with Gideon and like the background of the case. I do know it had to do with someone who was impoverished and could not afford an attorney and asked the courts to appoint him one, and the courts refused, and he was forced to represent himself and was convicted and appealed all the way to the Supreme Court.
And they said you have to give him a defense. I mean, so just, you know, from the fifth grader perspective, I think if you read you have the right to this, you have the right to A, B, C, D, and E. And none of those mean anybody has to give you anything. And I think this is one of the reasons over the years, I've gotten away from I don't even like to use the word rights anymore. I prefer to use consent. And it's partly because even if you try to take a purist approach and say, well, you have a right to a jury trial, it's like somebody has to provide you with a jury trial. You know, most of the time your understanding of right is it's a negative thing. It's like, leave me the hell alone. So I think that word has become almost useless for any kind of serious discussion, because two people can be talking about rights and they have a completely different conception of what.
At the same time, like, the jury box is one of the most powerful forms of activism an individual can undertake by just.
It absolutely is. And I'm not saying it's a bad thing to have jury trials. I'm just saying the word right isn't the correct. You know, my favorite quote probably of all time at this point is, you know, Confucius said that the first step towards wisdom is to call things by the right names. I love that idea. And so I would say, okay, you know what? It's a good idea. You could say, you could have a legislature say, it's a really good idea to provide people with a defense if they can't afford one. That's a really good idea. And we're going to do it out of compassion or because we have some end in mind, but it's not a right. Okay. You know, in the same way, it's like we think it's a really good idea that people get educated, but is there a right to education? No, there's a responsibility to be educated. And so as soon as you start,
there's a compelling government interest to have the population educated in a particular manner.
And yeah, right. Yeah, exactly. And that's what we're seeing. So, but yeah, I think this is the thing is that people get away, they confuse ends and means. And so, you know, for me, I'm always going back and say, look, are we talking about the principles that we're going to accept because we believe in them? Or are we going to say, what do we have to do to get some outcome that we like?
And those are just two different ways of doing things, you know. And so you should pick one and stick with it. But to say we're going to do outcome-based reasoning, but then we're going to pretend that it's, you know, premise-based reasoning, leads you to this situation where you're constantly just making up new premises. And that's common law. That's what judges do all day and all night, all on weekends. They just make up premises and say, well, this is the rule we're using. But they never have to go back and say, does this conflict with any other rules? Because as soon as you get rules that conflict, you've destroyed the ability to do deduction. It's just gone. This is completeness versus consistency. And I don't know if you're familiar with this. But
well, I think the big question that arises from all of this is you've identified a series of problems. You've identified a bunch of root causes of the problems. Which one came first isn't as important as which one can be fixed. And we can point to the 14th. We can point to Article 3. We can point to the Constitution. We can point to the whims of judges. We can point to Mayberry or any other decision where they've done these things. But like the question is, and this is one of the problems I come all across a lot when talking to other libertarians, especially libertarians running for office. People who run for office all the time on a platform of here's all the problems, never here are the solutions. And while we can say hypothetically in our little utopian free world in the future, we'd never had the Constitution, we never had Article 3, we never had the 14th Amendment, we never had Mayberry. These never became issues. How do we fix it now?
Okay, so thank you for asking. Here's how I'd fix it. Okay, so first thing, if I could do anything, I would do three things. One, I would get rid of voir dire with jury selection. Voir dire is French for jury tampering, right? So this is the selection where you go in and you throw out all the people who disagree with the law or that you suspect might disagree with you. Because the whole point of a jury is to represent a cross-section of the community. And so it should be the first 12 people through the door, sit your ass down, and we're going to start the trial. So that's the first thing I would do. Second thing I would do is I would require everything to sunset after, say, 5 or 6 or 8 years. Pick some number. It doesn't matter. And the third thing I would do is I would say, look, we would like to use a mechanism that approaches consensus. So now, in order to have a new law, you can't pass a law with 51% of your representatives. It's got to be 95%. So if you had juries who could basically say, well, that's a bullshit law, we're not convicting anybody. And you have laws where if you make a mistake, it disappears without having to now lobby against all the people who favor the law. And if basically you can't get a law that almost everybody doesn't agree with, how big do you think the U.S. code would be at this point? It would be like 20 pages, okay? Because how many laws can you think of that 95% of people would agree on?
Not even the Second Amendment.
I think you'd have
not even the First Amendment.
12. Yeah, I think you'd have trouble getting past 12, right? Coming up with those things. So that's actually what I would like to see. You know, on a smaller scale, I would like to see things. You know, it'd be hard to do that. I would like to see legislatures reigning in courts and saying we're just getting rid of this whole stare decisis thing. You get to decide. Every decision that you make applies to that case and that case only. And if you see a problem, come and tell us about it. That is the mechanism. Now the court, rather than becoming, you know, the entity that makes up rules and usurps the legislature's power, basically is now sort of an alarm that goes, okay, you totally screwed this up. You need to go back and do this again, right? So those are things you could do, and those are the solutions I would have, and they have nothing to do with any particular rights. They're just trying to get a mechanism that operates consistently and predictably, right?
Sure.
So I think I've said this to you before, right? So in some sense, my political philosophy is ISO 9000, okay? Which means you should write down what you're going to do, and you should do it. And if you decide you should do something else, you should write that down and do that. But what you should never do is write down that you're going to do one thing and then do something completely different and pretend they're the same, right?
That's the old joke. If we let all of our laws be written by software programmers, we'd live in a libertarian dystopia.
Yeah, yeah, that might be true. But I mean, this is all I'm ever really complaining about is just I don't know what the right rules are, but I do know I really love the idea of consensus. And while absolute consensus is really difficult to accomplish, you could say something like 95%. We need 95% agreement.
The idea of a sunset clause to me is a fascinating one because it's not even a new and novel idea.
Right. It's not, and neither are super majorities. They already have things. I don't know. I think they have this in New Hampshire, like towns. If you want to do some kind of tax change, it has to be 3/5. You need you need 2/3 of both both houses of Congress to pass a constitutional amendment. You need 3/4 of the states to ratify. So super majorities are not a new idea. None of this is new, except the idea of saying, not even like the idea of saying you have to choose between statutory law and common law. You just have to choose.
Well, I'm just thinking it's not even a new and novel idea. And the only example, the only shining, stunning example that jumps to mind for me of a law that had a sunset provision was the 1994 assault weapons ban.
And thank God for that.
And when it sunsetted, there is not political or social will to put it back.
That's right. Yeah. So, and imagine if that happened for almost everything. And imagine if the amount of will required was not, we got 51%, but it was, 95% or even 85% or 80 or whatever. It's just so much would never happen. You just
now I'm stuck in a mental where I want to go look back and how did they get a sunset clause into the assault weapons ban? That's actually something I'm now fascinated to find out.
Yeah, I believe it was. I mean, I was out of the country when it happened. We came back, and that was one of the things. Given to talk about this, it'll turn into a book. It's just I came back, and I bought a gun, CZ75, and I was trying to get 15-round magazines. So like, you can't have those. I'm like, what do you mean I can't have those? It's like, what? What is like? What do you think I could do with 2 15-rounders that I couldn't do with 3 10-rounders? What? This doesn't make any sense. But who the hell are you to tell me anyway? And that was what got the whole ball rolling. Until then, I was just sort of not politically thoughtful at all and didn't really care. And that, like, suddenly getting treated like a presumptive criminal, that really got to me. I was just like, this is just not acceptable. I don't understand this at all.
Well, I'm looking forward to actually picking up and getting a chance to read your book once I actually fix my Kindle device so I can. That was all on me. And I'm looking forward to your next book because I said at the beginning of the show, I said it before, I said it at Liberty Forum, I'll say it every time. You're probably the smartest person that I have the chance to talk to on a regular basis, at the very least, that I know at all, possibly. And I've learned a ton tonight. I learned a ton every time I talk to you, and I'm sure I'm going to learn even more that you've probably forgotten more than I have the chance to learn about a lot of these subjects with the ins and outs of deep libertarian philosophy, and it fascinates me to learn for you. Ian, where can everybody get a copy of your book, 14, How the 14th Amendment Ate the First 10?
So it's at Amazon. You can go to bareminimumbooks.com and you can sign up to be notified when new books come out. Once we get the process going, I'm hoping to get them out every 1 or 2 months.
If you guys are watching on YouTube or Odyssey or Facebook or listening in any of your favorite podcast apps, Spotify, Apple, iTunes, LRN FM, in the description there is a link. You can go pick up the book on Amazon. I'm looking forward to it. I wish I got the chance to read it beforehand, but that was all on me and my technological shortcomings because my refusal to upgrade. So, but I am definitely looking forward to giving it a read this week, and I'm looking forward to what you have next. And thank you so much for coming on, Ian. Is there any final thoughts you want to leave everyone with?
Just read the book. It's a short book. You'll get through it.
The bare minimum.
Yeah, it's one idea per page. I mean, I would just, if you have time, I'll tell you where I got the idea for the format of the book, and it was David Foster Wallace, the author. He gave a talk at Kenyon College, and it was called, This is Water. And I read the book, and it was basically a sentence per page. It was like, oh my God, this is so pleasant. Reading a book this way, where you don't feel like I'm in the middle of a 12-page chapter and I don't know where I am, and if I look away for a minute and I come back. So I've tried to make this the most pleasant possible reading experience, considering the unpleasantness of the topic.
That's something libertarians struggle with, making difficult topics pleasant to discuss, and because nobody wants to discuss anything unpleasant.
Yeah. So this is, as I said, you read it and you won't be any less angry, but you'll know where to direct your anger.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming on. Thanks for joining. As a great, insightful talk. I look forward to reading this and your next books and having you on again in the future.
All right. Well, thank you.
Well, thank you again. Until next time, everybody, thank you for tuning in. Thank you for watching. Give a big like, a subscribe, leave some comments in the chat and on the board. Let me know what you thought about the show and what kind of topics you want me to see me cover in the future. And until next time, be free. Thank you for tuning in to another episode of Subversive. Make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications to get alerted every time we go live on YouTube. And make sure to leave some comments and reviews on whatever platform you listen on to let me know what you thought of this episode. And a huge thanks and shout out to our sponsors and the awesome members of the Insurgency on Patreon. If you enjoyed this content, you can join the Insurgency on Patreon by following the links in the description for patreon.com/O'Donnell. And if you can't catch the show live, you can always catch it the next day on YouTube, Odyssey, Anchor, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Breaker, CastBox, and wherever else you listen to your favorite podcasts every day. So until next time, everybody, be free.